General Hospital spoilers for Friday, June 20th reveal that Tracy Quartermaine had survived scandals, lawsuits, betrayals, and even death hoaxes throughout her storied life at the top of Port Charles society, but nothing had prepared her for the quiet, methodical unraveling she now faced. For decades, she had thrived on power plays, navigating hostile takeovers with an iron fist and a sharpened tongue. But this time, the threat wasn't coming from a rival corporation or an estranged family member seeking revenge. It was coming from within. From someone she once reluctantly supported. From Drew Quartermaine. At first, Drew's return to the Quartermaine fold had seemed like a gift from the past. He'd been steady, if not strategic, and his presence had helped stabilize ELQ during periods of volatility. Tracy had even begun to tolerate his optimism, his insistence on doing business the right way. But somewhere along the line, Drew changed. And now, she could see it in his eyes, the fire, the anger, the desperation. What began as tension over business decisions had escalated into a full-scale power struggle, and Tracy, for the first time in years, felt like she was losing ground on her home turf. Drew had become unpredictable. His recent actions, bold acquisitions without board approval, secret meetings with outside investors, veiled threats toward key stakeholders, signaled a man no longer interested in collaboration. He was consolidating power, not sharing it. And his rhetoric had shifted, too. He spoke of legacy with a possessiveness that chilled her, as if the Quartermaine name were his alone to defend, to redefine, to reshape. His speeches had the cadence of a man who believed he'd been wronged. And in Drew's mind, Tracy knew, she was likely one of the architects of that betrayal. Ned, usually her first line of support in any corporate standoff, had noticed it too. And for once, he didn't have an answer. The two of them had spent countless hours combing through ELQ's financials, examining Drew's recent moves, tracking down whispers of shell companies and offshore accounts. The evidence was circumstantial but mounting. Drew was preparing something. Whether it was a corporate coup or a personal vendetta masquerading as a boardroom shakeup, Tracy couldn't yet tell. But she could feel it tightening around her neck like a noose. For the first time in a very long time, Tracy felt cornered. Not because she lacked power, but because she didn't understand the enemy's endgame. Drew had always been more of a soldier than a strategist, someone who followed orders, not someone who rewrote the rules. But now, he was both general and tactician. And his battlefield was expanding beyond ELQ. He was aligning with outsiders, exploiting the fractures between Quartermaine family members, and using the chaos of Michael's custody battles and Willow's collapse to cloak his ascent. Tracy watched as Drew began to exert influence over departments he previously ignored, legal, R&D, even international operations. He had turned once loyal executives into silent allies with vague promises of vision and transformation. And worse, the public was buying it. Drew's image as the noble veteran, the self-made man, was hard to attack without looking petty or paranoid. Tracy knew she needed more than instinct and legacy to win this fight. She needed leverage. And fast. Behind closed doors, she and Ned began strategizing like it was 1989 again. They combed through Drew's travel logs, flagged irregularities in hiring, and quietly reconnected with allies in the media who still owed them favors. Ned, though rattled, was resolute. This wasn't just about ELQ, it was about preserving the very structure of the family business. About making sure that the Quartermaine legacy wasn't reshaped by a man acting out of pain and pride. What Tracy feared most wasn't Drew's ambition, it was his unraveling. She'd seen this kind of obsession before. She'd lived through it. Men who thought they were saving something by burning it to the ground. And she could see it in Drew's eyes now. This wasn't business anymore. It was personal. He was trying to make someone pay. Maybe Nina, maybe Michael, maybe even her. And ELQ was just the weapon he intended to use. She remembered a time, not too long ago, when Drew had come to her for guidance, unsure of his place in the family. Now, he didn't ask for advice. He issued ultimatums. He used silence like a sword, making allies nervous and enemies bolder. And while his charm hadn't completely faded, it had become a mask, one that barely concealed the fury underneath. Tracy had to admit it, Drew was winning the psychological war. She was reacting, not leading. And that was not a position she was willing to tolerate for much longer. Something had to shift. Whether that meant calling in old debts, threatening resignations, or leaking information to destabilize Drew's support system, she wasn't sure. But she knew the time for hesitation had passed. Drew had already taken too much ground. Her conversations with Ned grew more urgent. They spoke in code, in late-night meetings by firelight, knowing that the walls at the mansion had ears. They began planning contingency votes, building coalitions within the board, even floating the idea of offering seats to old enemies just to weaken Drew's majority. It was ugly. And it was desperate, but that's what survival looked like now. Tracy knew she couldn't appeal to Drew with sentiment. That ship had sailed. He didn't want reconciliation. He wanted vindication. And the problem was, no one knew what it would take to satisfy that hunger, or how much destruction he'd leave behind in trying to feed it. If he kept pushing. If he kept using family business as a weapon in his crusade, the damage could become irreversible. The name Quartermain would no longer stand for legacy, resilience, or tradition. It would stand for chaos. For blood spilled behind boardroom doors. But Tracy hadn't built her empire on sentiment. She'd built it on survival. On outlasting every man who thought he could silence her. And she wasn't about to let Drew Quartermain be the exception. Not now. Not when she could feel the whole house beginning to shake. The explosion, she knew, was coming. But if she and Ned moved first, if they forced Drew's hand, they might just be able to turn the blast in their favor. And if they couldn't stop the chaos, they could at least decide who got buried beneath it. It was supposed to be just another ordinary afternoon in Port Charles, but for Emma, it became something else entirely. She hadn't expected to run into Gio Palmieri in the quiet corner of the library at General Hospital, but when she did, the air between them shifted almost immediately. It wasn't just the coincidence of timing, it was the unspoken weight of what brought them both there. Emma had been quietly, relentlessly chasing a truth no one else seemed ready to confront. The increasingly erratic behavior and hidden agenda of Professor Hank Dalton. And now, more than ever, she needed someone to trust. Someone who wasn't compromised. Someone like Gio. He had always been a quiet force in the background, watchful, intense, misunderstood. But Emma saw through the walls Gio kept around him. There was a fire in his eyes. The kind that belonged to someone who had spent too much time living in other people's shadows. Maybe that's what drew her to him. Maybe that's why. When she finally gathered the courage to tell someone about what she'd uncovered about Dalton, the late-night meetings, the hidden files, the strange connections to a pharmaceutical lab no one else was investigating, she chose Gio. Their conversation began cautiously. Emma had learned not to trust too easily. And Gio wasn't exactly the confiding type. But when she laid out her findings, Dalton's unexplained absences, the encrypted messages she'd intercepted from his office, the list of names tied to a classified research program, Gio didn't flinch. He didn't dismiss her. Instead, he listened, leaning in, eyes narrowing not with skepticism but focus. And then he did something Emma didn't expect. He offered to help. From that moment on, they became a team, not official, not public, but bound by a shared sense of urgency and danger. As they began to dig deeper into Dalton's connections, they found themselves thrown into a world that was far more sinister than they'd imagined. There were trails of financial transactions tied to offshore accounts, records of experimental treatments being administered without oversight, and whispers about a project called Revita 9. Something so deeply buried in institutional secrecy that even seasoned investigators were afraid to speak its name. And through it all, Emma and Gio grew closer. The long nights poring over documents, the stolen moments of laughter between strategy sessions, the way he always stood just a step behind her, ready to protect. But never to control, began to blur the lines between partnership and something more intimate. For Emma, who had spent most of her life balancing responsibility and isolation, it was a revelation. For Gio, whose past was marked by secrets and a deep-rooted fear of vulnerability, Emma was a kind of clarity he'd never known. There was one night in particular, a storm swept through Port Charles, knocking out the power in half the city. Emma and Gio were holed up in the empty records room at GH, surrounded by files that might implicate Dalton in the cover-up of a dangerous medical trial. As thunder rattled the windows, Gio reached for Emma's hand, not with hesitation, but with quiet certainty. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. It was more than that. It was a silent pact. Whatever was coming next, they'd face it together. But love, especially one forged in the crucible of danger and secrecy, never comes easy. Emma's involvement in the investigation put her directly in Dalton's crosshairs. There were veiled threats, suspicious accidents, and a growing sense that time was running out. Gio, who had once promised himself he'd never let anyone get close enough to become a liability, now found himself unable to let Emma go. He watched her every move with a protective intensity that bordered on desperation. Not because he doubted her strength, Emma was brilliant, relentless, but because he knew what men like Dalton were capable of. He had seen it before. And he wasn't going to let it happen again. Emma, too, wrestled with her own doubts. She had always prided herself on her independence, her intellect. But now, she wasn't just fighting for the truth, she was fighting with someone by her side. And that made everything more dangerous. Because if Dalton knew how much Gio meant to her, he'd use it. He'd weaponize it. And that scared her more than anything. Still, they pressed forward. Every new discovery brought them closer not only to exposing Dalton's true identity and motivations, but to understanding each other. Gio revealed parts of his past Emma hadn't known. The struggles of growing up with a complicated legacy, the burden of being a palmieri in a world that constantly asked him to prove his worth. Emma, in turn, let him see the cracks beneath her polished exterior, the fear of failure, the loneliness, the weight of being a Scorpio in a town that expected nothing less than brilliance. And through it all, their bond only deepened. As the investigation reached its tipping point, Emma and Gio stood on the edge of something neither of them had ever known before, a connection forged not in ease, but in fire. What had started as necessity had become trust. What had started as strategy had become love. And what had started as two people chasing the truth had become a story neither of them could walk away from. Because in the heart of a mystery that could tear Port Charles apart, they had found each other. And now, more than ever, they knew that whatever came next, whatever secrets were still buried, whatever enemies still lurked in the shadows, they wouldn't face it alone. Christina knew something was wrong. She had felt it growing for weeks, an undercurrent of unease that curled beneath her skin like smoke before fire. And now, it was undeniable. She couldn't stay silent any longer. The warning she carried wasn't just born from paranoia or instinct. It was a truth forming in the shadows, a dangerous certainty. Ava Jerome was not done. And this time, her target wasn't just another rival or a business deal gone sour. It was the family, her family. And that meant Michael needed to know. Immediately. The confrontation came in private. Behind closed doors at the Metro Court, far from wandering ears and curious glances. Christina didn't waste time with pleasantries. She laid it out plainly. Ava had been making moves. Quiet ones. Strategic ones. But moves nonetheless. She'd noticed it in the way Ava had reinserted herself into Sonny's life, not as an ally, but as a threat cloaked in faux concern. She had begun asking questions she had no reason to ask, reviving old tensions, leveraging her shared custody connection to Avery as a weapon. And worse. Christina had overheard snippets of conversations, half-finished phone calls laced with veiled implications. Ava was planning something. Something dangerous. And Christina feared it was already in motion. Michael, still recovering from the chaos of his own battles, Willow, Drew, Nina, listened carefully. He had always been more calculated, more restrained. But even he couldn't ignore the urgency in Christina's voice. Because she wasn't panicking. She was warning. And that was more terrifying. Ava had a history of chaos masked by elegance. She could manipulate with a smile, destroy with a whisper. And now, Christina believed she was setting the stage for something far worse than a custody dispute or a corporate betrayal. This was personal. This was vengeance. What set Christina on edge wasn't just Ava's presence, it was her precision. Ava had been showing up at odd places at exactly the right time. She had begun asking questions about Wiley, about Nina's downfall, about Drew's spiraling behavior. She knew too much, even things she shouldn't know unless someone had been feeding her information. Christina suspected Ava had a new ally, someone inside the Corinthos circle, or worse, someone inside the Quartermain fold. And if that was true, then they were already compromised. Christina urged Michael to look beyond the obvious. Ava wasn't coming for them with guns or blackmail, at least not yet. She was dismantling them emotionally, psychologically. Her plan, Christina feared, was to isolate Michael from his allies, to sow division between him and Sonny, to drive a wedge into the fragile bond between Michael and Willow. Ava knew how to exploit trauma. How to weaponize guilt. She had done it before. And if Michael didn't act quickly, Christina feared they would all wake up one day to find themselves surrounded, and too late to stop her. Michael didn't want to believe it, not fully. He had too much on his plate, too many fires to put out. But Christina's warning hit a nerve. Because deep down, he remembered what Ava was capable of when she felt cornered. And with Nina's public fall from grace, with Drew's empire collapsing, and with the family splintering under legal, emotional, and financial warfare, Ava had opportunity. And with opportunity came danger. What Christina feared most wasn't a single, violent act. It was something slower. Something far more insidious. She feared Ava would go after their foundations, undermining Sonny's judgment, casting doubt on Carly's influence, isolating Willow and her grief, manipulating Avery as leverage. She would twist truths until Michael became the enemy, until loyalty frayed, until trust evaporated. And if Christina was right, and every instinct in her told her she was, then Ava had already started. The warning had been delivered. Now the question remained, would Michael listen before it was too late? Or would Ava strike while the family continued to fight its battles on the wrong front? One thing was clear, the fire was coming. And Christina was no longer willing to watch her family burn without a fight. Ava had grown accustomed to watching people lose control. But witnessing Nina's descent was something else entirely. Nina was no longer fighting for love, redemption, or even forgiveness. She was fighting to cling to the last remnants of power in a life that was falling apart piece by piece. Her actions had lost all sense of strategy and had become nothing more than erratic, panicked reactions driven by fear, guilt, and obsession. Ava, once her closest confidant, could no longer stand by and remain silent. She delivered a final warning, urging Nina to stop before she destroyed everything. She told her to pull back. To let go of the toxic need to control what was already lost. But Nina refused to listen. Her eyes burned with suspicion and fury, convinced that Ava had betrayed her. Convinced that she had aligned herself with Carly and Michael, the very people Nina believed had torn her life apart. Ava didn't argue. She knew there was no reasoning with someone already drowning in delusion. And as she walked away, she knew the collapse was already underway. Nina's so-called adjustments were nothing but desperate grasps for relevance, her schemes unraveling into chaos. She had pushed away her few remaining allies and was now on the brink of destroying not just her chances at reconnecting with Willow, Wiley, and Amelia, but her own sanity. Ava, from a distance, could only watch as Nina spiraled further, knowing that soon there would be nothing left to save. Willow stood on the edge of a decision that could alter everything. staring into the emotional abyss created by Drew's unexpected and unsettling marriage proposal. What should have been a gesture of love now loomed over her like a calculated trap. Suffocating in its timing, overwhelming in its implications. Drew, once her savior during a dark chapter of her life, had transformed into something far more complex, driven not by devotion, but by a new kind of obsession. His words were gentle, his eyes pleading, but underneath it all lay a cold, unsettling urgency that Willow couldn't quite name. This wasn't about healing or moving forward. This was about control. The proposal came at her most fragile moment, after she had lost custody of Wiley and Amelia. After her world had fractured and her identity as a mother was torn from her hands. Drew knew she was vulnerable. He knew the grief still clung to her like a second skin. And instead of giving her space to breathe, he moved in closer, wrapping the idea of marriage in promises of stability and protection. But to Willow, it felt less like love and more like a carefully timed invasion. A new kind of pressure began to build, tightening with every passing day, every forced smile. Every carefully crafted argument he made about why they should become a family. Behind Drew's soft-spoken tone and gentle facade, Willow could sense something more dangerous, a desperate need to reclaim control over something, anything, in a world where he was rapidly losing influence. His obsession with marriage wasn't rooted in romance. It was a manifestation of his unraveling psyche. And Willow, already teetering on the edge, could feel herself being pulled into his storm. There were moments when she caught him watching her too closely, moments when his temper flared in subtle but unmistakable ways. The air around them had changed. It was no longer safe. As she tried to gather her thoughts, Willow realized that this proposal wasn't just a personal decision, it was a psychological battlefield. Accepting it would mean surrendering to someone who seemed more invested in possessing her than loving her. Declining it would likely ignite something far darker. She could already see the shift in Drew's behavior. The man who once championed her independence now questioned her every move. He spoke in circles about protecting her, rebuilding their future, and reclaiming what was taken from them. But none of it felt real. It felt like performance, desperate, delusional, and increasingly dangerous. This new madness, masked as affection, was growing by the day. And it wasn't just about Drew's obsession. It was about the isolation he was creating around her. She had already drifted from Jason. Carly had grown distant. Nina was completely cut off. And Michael, once her center, was a wound that hadn't healed. Now, Drew was inserting himself into every corner of her life, becoming the only voice she heard. The only presence she saw. His proposal was a cage disguised as comfort. And she was beginning to see it for what it truly was. Willow's instinct screamed for escape. But the emotional and psychological manipulation had already begun to dull her strength. Each time she tried to protest, Drew softened his tone, reminded her of how much they had survived. How much he had done for her. It was subtle, but persistent. Gaslighting wrapped in affection. It confused her. Made her doubt herself. And that was exactly what he wanted. Meanwhile, around them, the situation was beginning to erupt. The fallout from Drew's actions, his manipulation of Portia, his conflicts with Michael, his blackmail tactics, was spreading fast. Willow was becoming the epicenter of a much larger explosion, one that Drew had lit the match for. His proposal was not just about their relationship. It was a symbol of how far he was willing to go to regain control in a world where he was no longer the hero, but the threat. And if Willow didn't act soon, she would be consumed by the very madness he had wrapped around her like a net. This was no longer about love. It was about survival. And the clock was ticking.